My name is Dorothy Sanchez, and I haven't gotten to do a session like this in quite some time. I'm at Teachstone, but before I was at Teachstone, I worked at the University of Miami, and I was a coach and a trainer. And I coached early Head Start and Head Start, infant and toddler and preschool teachers. So that was really fun. And I was born and raised here in Miami, so I've worked here my whole life. So I've been coaching all across Miami-Dade County for all of my career. So it's been really great, and I'm really happy that I get to host this here today with you all. And there's something that Bridget said earlier in this keynote, if you were there. And she said, class is the way that we kind of found each other, but there's something a little bit deeper that weaves us all together. And that stuck with me because I think it's a really wonderful example of it not being all just about the class, right? And especially if you're here, you know that. You know, supporting dual language learners, we have the class that can help us sort of see how these interactions with dual language learners are going, but that's not all, right? There's more. So I'm really excited that I get to talk with you all today, and I'm excited that you're here for the last session of the day. Woohoo! All right, great. So if you feel comfortable, I'd like for you to raise your hand on different points here today. So raise your hand if you speak multiple languages. More than one. Yep. Cool. All right. Great. And raise your hand if you feel comfortable. Raise your hand if you learned English as an adult. Awesome. Great. And I like to ask that question because I think that also gives you a pretty unique perspective and understanding and empathy with dual language learners, right? Because you remember what that's like. You remember like having to learn a new language and communicate with people, especially as being an adult. You have a different perspective on those challenges, right? And how many of you are educators who work directly with dual language learners? Cool. Raise them proud, you guys. Come on. Yeah. All right. And how many of you are coaches who work with teachers who work with dual language learners? Awesome. Love coaches. And how many of you are leaders or directors or deputy directors? All right. Hi. Oh, great. And how many of you are observers or trainers? You mostly deliver training, or you mostly observe in classrooms that have dual language learners? Awesome. All right. So there's definitely a mix of roles in here, so that's helpful for me to know. And in the spirit of this session, right, dual language learning, whose first language is something other than English that wants to help us learn a new word today? So whose first language is not English? I know that you all have over here. Irina. My friend and colleague Irina over here, can you teach us how to say connection in your home language? First, tell us what your home language is.
My home language is Russian. How to say connection? Oh gosh, now I feel on the spot. I was just going to give you a random word.
No, don't do that.
You wouldn't, does anyone speak Russian? You wouldn't know. It's actually коннектировать. Коннектировать. It actually has the same root as connect.
It does. It sounds a little bit similar. Thank you. Thank you. Can you actually come up and write it on here? I'd love
in Russian?
Yeah. Do you know how to write it in Russian?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. And while Irina does that, can we give her a round of applause? Thank you. And so just to give you a little bit of an overview of what today is going to be the rest of our 40 minutes. So we'll go over some foundational information. Obviously, you all are here because you care very much about dual language learners. So there's a chance that you already know a lot of this information, but I'd love to just get us all on the same page. And then I also want to ask you about your own wonderings and things that you might be wondering. Then we'll talk a little bit more about some guiding principles of effective interactions, which you probably have already heard a little bit about being here today, listening to us talk about second edition. And then we're going to take it back to connect, engage, and inspire, which you also probably have heard a lot today. And then I want to close out with some time to give you all to plan, right? There's a value in being here and listening and thinking and reflecting, but the real value is in taking some of the information that you think about today and the ideas and the inspiration that you have and actually doing something with it. So you can think about what you're going to do on Thursday or tomorrow when you interact with other adults, or on Thursday when you go back to the real world and your jobs. And so speaking of languages, thank you, Irina, for the connection over there. Speaking of languages, I just want to align on the terms that I'm going to be using today. And so today we're using the term dual language learner, although there are many different ways that people all across the country refer to children who are learning multiple languages, right? So here's a definition of dual language learners, but in some states they're called multilingual learners. In the K-12 space, they're called English learners or English language learners, or we're talking about English language development, right? So you might call them different things depending on where you're from and what model you follow. But today the term that I'm going to be using is DLL, just because that's a little bit more common. And I'm also going to be talking about home languages. There's so many different ways to refer to somebody's, the language that their family speaks to them at home, right? We're thinking about young children. It could be more than one home language. There's terms like first language, native tongue, mother tongue, L1 if you're in that K through 12 space. So just to reiterate, I'm just going to be using those because they're pretty common, but think about it as encompassing, the wide variety of different children and different families. And so just to go over some foundational information here, we know that young children can learn and be proficient in multiple languages at once, right? So there was that common myth that we who have worked in the DLL space for a while have been trying to combat, and that's that children who are learning multiple languages experience delays in language. And we know through research that that's just not true. So what happens is that children from infancy are ready to acquire all forms of communication, all kinds of verbal communication, nonverbal communication. They're already picking up those cues. And so the earlier that we expose children to multiple languages, the better that they can make those neural networks in their brain that are going to sustain and build the foundation for those languages. So young children can learn multiple languages at once and become proficient in those languages too. And obviously we know that multilingualism and bilingualism is a strength and it's an asset, and there are so many social, economic, academic, cognitive benefits to multilingualism, right? There's a lot of research that tells us what those are. And strong partnerships with families are essential for children who are DLLs. So that goes for all children, right? We know that a strong partnership between families and educators and that bidirectional communication is really beneficial for children's social emotional development and other areas of development. But for multilingual learners and DLLs, it's especially true. It's especially important. And I know that some of you are wondering, okay, yeah, that's the hard part, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more today about what that might look like in your cases. And lastly, multilingual learners and DLL children really benefit from high quality instruction in both languages. And it's okay if you're not fluent in a child's home language, you can still find ways to support that. And again, that's really difficult. It can be really difficult. So we are going to talk about some of the ways that we can do that today. And I want to reassure everybody that, again, you don't really need to be fluent in that language, but you still want to be able to provide some of that home language support to children, because that foundation in their home language is really going to set them up for success in any other language that they're going to learn later. And so, some guiding principles. If you were at the keynote, you probably have heard a little bit about this, or if you've attended a second edition training before. So these guiding principles of effective interactions really are helping to shape the evolution of class that we're undergoing right now. And it's not just an evolution to class second edition, but it's something broader. It's something that's shaping the way that we are enhancing the current offerings that we have, and it's really shaping the way that we are thinking about the approach to the support that we provide. So we spent a lot of time listening to a wide variety of communities, listening to practitioners at different levels, right? Local, state agencies, national advocates, and we know that the support that we provide you as Teachstone has to honor your individual ways of being. It has to honor different teaching styles. It has to honor people's authentic ways of interacting and children's authentic needs, right? It's not one size fits all. And so the first principle that's guiding that idea is honoring individual and cultural variations and ways of being. So that means intentionally recognizing and celebrating the fact that we are all different, and that in each classroom community there's variations in abilities, cultural traditions, environments, interests, languages, needs, and preferences. So if we think about that for language and in terms of linguistic variation, it's important for you as an educator or as a coach or as a director to know who your children are, right? And it's also important to know who you are. A lot of the times when we think about linguistic variation and a different home language, we're also talking about a difference in cultural traditions, right? A lot of the times if somebody speaks a different language than you are, chances are that they probably come from a different cultural background than you. So there's an added layer of complexity there, so it's not just about language, but it's also about honoring the ways of being and different ways of communicating that a child that's a member of that community might have. And so it's really important to keep this in mind as we continue talking, right? Just acknowledging that there's a lot of variation and a lot of things that make us unique, and we have to honor that. And another principle that's guiding the way that we're sort of doing things now at Teachstone is that we have to individualize interactions to support each child. And so interactions with children can and should vary depending on their needs, depending on their preferences, depending on who they are, depending on who you are, right? You when you're interacting with children. And so to really understand them and how to interact in that moment, there's a lot of learning that we have to do about and really truly understand who our children are, who the families are, what their values are. And it's really when all children have that opportunity to have those individualized interactions is when we see that they thrive. So that's a small summary of the guiding principles that are behind not only Class Second Edition, but a lot of the other offerings and services that we're developing at Teachstone. And so I want to bring us back to this idea of connecting. And so take a moment to think about an educator in your life that had a really positive impact for you. So just take a moment to think about an educator that you felt a connection with. And maybe think if there's a particular moment that you remember that has stuck with you. And so for me, when I was thinking about this, I have very vivid memories of my teacher in preschool talking to my parents. And yeah, it's really interesting. You wouldn't think, and I think it's because this teacher ended up being a very important figure in my life. She actually shaped a lot of the educational decisions that my parents made because she was really invested in my education from the very beginning. And I remember her talking to my parents and telling them that I was helping her to take attendance, and that I was helping her to count how many children were in the classroom today, and how many children are at home, and how many children do we have in total. And so she was telling them about that. And my parents didn't speak English, and I didn't speak English. But my teacher made it very clear to them from the beginning that she was invested in my potential, and that I had potential, and that I was going to be perfectly fine, even though I didn't know English. And that stuck, and I remember that. And so that teacher ended up she was incredible. She was also my second grade teacher, so she moved up with us, and she gave my parents advice on which middle school I should go to. She gave my parents advice on which high school I should go to. So I feel like I attribute a lot of my educational journey to that teacher. Her name was Ms. Sardinez, and now I'm getting emotional. So that's what we mean by connections. We mean building a caring, inclusive community where we really care and honor about the children who are in our lives and their families. And we want to make sure that every child feels valued, feels loved, feels supported, and creating an environment that is centered around those children's contributions and their ideas and their perspectives and who they are, right? So this sounds very similar to the class, right? And so when we think about DLL children, what does that mean? Making them feel accepted, making them feel honored, making them feel that love, right? We need to help them see it, and we need to help them hear it. right? We accept who our children are, our dual language learning children are, right? So let them see and hear that acceptance so that they can feel it. So that means, this looks very small. I apologize for all of you back there. But you will have the slides in the Whova app. Thank you to my friends over here for reminding me. You will be getting these slides. So help DLL children see and hear that acceptance. So that means reflecting their home languages in the setting, in what they see, and also in what they hear. So that means things like children's names and what they call their families, learning those names, those nicknames that they have for their families. What do they call their mamas and what do they call their papas? And emotion words and key routines and phrases and those words for those, right? So if you have a child in your classroom who speaks Portuguese at home and that child is a young infant, the way that we continuously promote that home language and make that child feel even more comfortable in those routine times that are a little strange for them, right? When we're changing their diaper, we have to learn how to say diaper in Portuguese so that when we're changing their diaper, they start to get that association and understand what's happening a little bit more, right? So that's one simple way where you can incorporate some of that home language into a routine to make them feel more comfortable. And we're also talking about the physical environment. Your labels. If you're labeling your materials, or if you're labeling your furniture in the classroom in multiple languages, make sure that those labels all are on the same size that the English label is in, right? If we see a label on a chair that says English, a chair over here, we want to see it in the same size in those other languages too, because that is communicating to that child that their home language and their linguistic identity is important and it's valued in my classroom too. And their favorite materials or their favorite experiences, something that the children really, really like to do. Learn what those things are called in their home languages, or something that they really love in their classroom. Learn what those things are called in their languages. And you also want to reflect their cultural traditions, not just the home language, but also some of their cultural traditions too, in familiar objects, in familiar images, or in songs and chants, right? That's another way that they can hear that language happening in their classroom. And so what does this mean for families, connecting with families? It means helping families feel that acceptance too. That acceptance that you have toward their child, help families see and feel and hear that too. So interact with them in ways that convey your respect towards them. So we want to encourage families to speak in their home languages to their children at home and explain to them the benefits of that and encourage them so that they know that their language should be a point of pride and it's not something that we're trying to discourage, and it's actually going to help them get a better foundation to acquire English better. And invite their expertise. So connecting with families is about giving them the space to learn, for you to learn who they are and make them feel like the experts. And they are the experts on their children, right? They're the ones that know exactly who their kiddos are. So invite that expertise. And there is a family languages and interests interview template that I linked on the slides later on, so that when you see them in your Whova app, you have them. But that's a template of an interview in which you can ask families more about their language traditions, but also about their goals for their children and about things that they like to do at home and about their kids' favorite activities and their own cultural traditional activities. And so helping you learn a little bit more about families not only is going to help you bring that learning into the classroom, but it also communicates to the families, this person who cares about my child, cares about my child's future, cares about me, cares about and respects us. So that's going to really help open up that partnership with families. And so now I invite you to take a moment to think and write if you would like to. I know that you all have some notebooks. I had some paper in here earlier, but I don't see it anymore. But if you have a notebook or on your phone and your notes app, somewhere where you can write and think, who are the DLL children that are in your program? So if you're a coach, or if you're a director, or a leader, or an observer, think about, do you know who the educators are that are caring for DLL children? Do you know who the classrooms, which classrooms you're going to that have DLL children in them? think about who they are. If you're a coach, these are questions that you can also ask your educators. All right, tell me about your DLL children. What do they like? What are you going to look up how to say? What information are you going to ask their families about? And for some of you, that might be a little bit more difficult, right? So just because children speak a lot of different home languages doesn't mean that we know all of the home languages that are represented in our classroom. So later on, I'm also going to ask you to think about what other resources do you need to make this happen? What other services might be beneficial to you? And who are you going to ask for help, right? Because you don't do this in isolation either, right? You need your own support system too to help you, because you can't figure out all of this on your own. So who are you going to ask for help? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Does anyone want to share that connection that they had with a teacher, an educator that had an impact on their life, a moment of connection that they had? Was anybody able to think of one that they want to share?
My fourth grade teacher had braces at the same time that I did. And so we connected over that, and I remember very clearly I had a wire that was poking me and it was hurting, and she pulled me up to her desk and she's like, oh, I found this little trick. If you use the eraser on your pencil, you can push your wire in and it won't hurt as bad, because I'm out of wax. And if I had a wire that was hurting, she would share her wax with me, and I would do the same thing with her if I had, because she used to put wax on your, I don't know if they still do that or not, but that was like this very just personal connection with her. Like, she knew what I was going through and could relate to it, and we shared that for that entire school year. And it was just something that's always stuck with me, because I knew she cared about me outside of the classroom, just for personal stuff.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem.
It's that same kind of empathy that we can think about that we want to have with children who are learning multiple languages at once and who are trying to communicate in ways that are new to them, right? Think about moments of time where you've tried to communicate something in the same language that you speak with somebody else and they've misunderstood you. Or a simple misunderstanding with somebody and you're speaking the same language. So those kinds of moments help you empathize and really connect with that child and have a new perspective on the children that you're supporting, right? And really helping you to understand the importance of honoring who they are and caring about them beyond just the classroom, which is a lot for you all as educators, as coaches, as administrators. So I think that's why it was so telling and truthful of Bridget to say there's something else that brings us here together, that really motivates us to take this time to get into these spaces. So thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that. All right. And so now when we think about the next part, we think about engage, right? Connect, engage, inspire learning. And so when we're thinking about engaging children, we're thinking about guiding children towards behavior that is safe, that is kind, that is fair. We're thinking about setting children up for success and in their learning and in their exploration. And we're also thinking about actively engaging children in ways that enhance their classroom experiences. And so what does that mean for children who are DLLs? It means being mindful that members of different cultural communities might have different behavioral expectations and different behavioral norms, right? So again, it's not only about the language, but also about different ways of being and interacting and different ways of either making requests or saying statements, right? It could be something as simple as, may I please go to the restroom? To, I'm going to the bathroom. That could be a simple difference in the ways that somebody communicates. And again, this is the same language, and still there's variations in the ways that people have expectations and engage in those kinds of behaviors. And so be mindful of that in addition to having visuals and supports and other ways that you're supporting that child in their home language. And also be mindful of using the home language when we're talking about behavior, right? What we don't want to see is instances where a child's home language is being used only to redirect behavior or only to call attention to something that they're doing, right? We want to see the home language being used in so many different contexts, right? In the richness of the experiences that are happening throughout the day. So be mindful of the ways in which we guide DLL children's behavior, and also be mindful of the peer interactions that are happening in your classroom, right? When we're talking about behavior that is fair and kind, we're talking about modeling the ways that we talk about that child and talk about the child who speaks a different language than us and how we talk about their different language to other children, and making sure that we're paying attention to how other children are reacting and how they're accepting that child who might speak a different language than them. And then when we're talking about setting children up for success and actively engaging them, we're talking about intentional preparation. So when you have DLL children in your care, there's some things that you need to do beforehand to really set children up for success, because you want to ask yourself, how am I going to make sure that this child is even able to fully participate in the experiences that I'm offering in my classroom? So if you can preview words in advance, right? Let's say if you have a child in an older grade and you are going to engage in a lesson about a certain concept, what words can you start previewing to that child? And we're going to talk about how to involve families, but what words, what concepts, what visuals can you start previewing before you get into the lesson the following week? And it's thinking about what kind of visuals, what kind of supporting artifacts, what kinds of things can you bring into that experience to help the child understand the things that you're talking about, so that they don't just have to rely on what they hear, but they can also rely on what they see. And we can also group pair up children who speak the same home language together as part of that intentional preparation to make sure that we are getting all of the children to benefit from this experience. And so for families, engaging them could mean letting them lead and inviting family members to participate or lead experiences like storytelling or book sharing. And I've linked also additional resources later on in the slides where you can see videos of the ways that educators have invited families to be a part of the classroom experiences and speak to the children in their home language and tell stories that reflect their cultural traditions, and really letting families be the ones that participate in that engagement and really bridging that gap there. And setting them up for success. So for involving families means sharing keywords, sharing lessons, sharing the ideas for experiences in advance so that families can start to build some of those connections at home, right? And encouraging them to do that. And so this takes us back to that connect idea. When you've made that connection with families, when you've opened that door with families, talking to them about what their language goals are for their children and learning about what their language traditions are and what they like to do at home with their kids, you're starting to open that door so that these requests and that these conversations become a little bit easier, and they understand the purpose of them. They understand the purpose is to make that connection between school and home. The purpose is to help the child fully immerse themselves into the experiences. And so again, I'm going to give you all some moments to write down some thoughts to these questions. How will you ensure that DLL children are able to fully participate in the learning experiences in your classroom? Again, if you're a coach, you can ask your educators this question. If you're a director, you can think about, what do I have in place that allows my DLL children to fully participate in my classroom experiences? What do I already have prepared? And are there things that are already coming up to you that you're missing or that you might need, right? Or you're thinking, what home languages do I have represented in my program? And if you don't know the answer to that, that's where you want to start. You want to think, okay, let me make sure that I understand the full breadth of the community that I'm serving to make sure that I can prepare my educators, that I can prepare my coaches, and that I can really make this possible for children in my program. And lastly, we want to talk about inspiring learning, right? Connect, engage, inspire learning. And so when we're talking about inspiring learning, we're talking about deepening children's understanding, their creativity, their thinking, meeting children where they are and enhancing their learning and motivation, and supporting children's verbal and nonverbal communication skills. So holistically supporting children in their thinking and the ways that they play and the ways that they create and the ways that they communicate. And so what that means for DLL children is introducing concepts in meaningful ways to them. Introduce keywords in the home language first. Use nonverbal communication to provide hints and challenges, right? So really think about the ways that you can make learning meaningful for them. And we talked about the ways that you can do that with giving families a preview and encouraging them to preview some concepts at home. And connecting to children's home lives, making that relevant for them, making it meaningful, so you can ask children themselves about their language, about how to say different words, about their home lives and their families and their own cultural traditions. So the more that we make children the experts and really think about the impact that they're having on our classrooms, on ourselves, on the other children in the classroom, making them the expert also really helps their thinking skills, right? And communicating how they're going to teach somebody something. And we want to build on their skills. So it's important for you to learn a little bit more about how children's skills are developing in each language. So I know that we have so many assessments on language for English. When you're thinking about a DLL child, if their home language is French, then we, as an educator, need to understand how is their French? What level are they? Like, what skills do they have? Are they able to string phrases together? What understanding do they have of that language? And that can also help you plan for how am I going to support their English language acquisition. So it's important to have an understanding of where they are in both languages or in multiple languages. And encouraging children to use the language that they feel most comfortable in. That's really important too, and making sure that they understand that their language is accepted in the classroom, and encouraging those conversations if they can have them with their peers that speak the same home language. And so for families, inspiring learning can mean sharing children's accomplishments and sharing their strengths. So let families know what that child is accomplishing in any area of development. What are they able to do? What are they able to say? Who are they playing with? What materials are they engaging with? What new thing did they do today that they couldn't do last week? Share those moments with families to start, again, making that connection, really helping them to understand the ways that their child is growing. We know a lot of families are also concerned about, okay, how is my child doing? Are they learning English? What about their other language skills? And so we want to make sure that we're sharing a lot of the positive growth with families, in addition to also talking to them, okay, now where is it that we want to go next? Building that partnership with families is going to be helpful. It's going to be helpful to build that partnership with families when you're sharing that positive information with them. And so you also want to connect to children's home lives, and we've talked about that too. Asking families about children's interests and activities at home and things that they like to do at home. And that can also be part of that interview that you all do to really learn about the ways that you can connect the learning from school and at home. And so here's another prompt for your writing. So what have DLL children been accomplishing? How are you going to share that with families? So again, think about who your kiddos are. If you're a coach, think about which educators you have that have DLL children. You can ask them these questions. What have they been doing? What can they do now that they couldn't do last week? How are they going to share that information with families? And so now, I want to give you all a few minutes to think about your plans and the things that you have written and the reflections that you've had. So here I've repeated the prompts that we talked about in the last few slides, but like I said earlier, there are going to be other resources that you're going to need to be able to effectively support DLL children. This by no means covers all the different ways and all of the different DLL specific strategies that there are to help children who are DLL in multiple areas of development. And so what other questions and wonderings do you have? And who can you ask for help? Who can you go to? Is there a community organization that you can go to that can partner with you to help bridge some of that language gap if you don't have any staff members who speak your children's home languages? What kind of leadership support can you ask for? Does your leader understand the full needs of the children that you're serving? So I think the who will you ask for help is a really big one too, because this all works when people at your program, when your staff, when your philosophies are all aligned in the way that you are going to provide those supports to DLL children. So it's really important. This work just is not done in isolation. And it's so important that you have that support and that support system, and you can know where to go. And what other translation services can you occupy to help you communicate with families with which you don't share that language? Does anybody have any ideas that they'd like to share? Does anybody have any answers to these kind of questions that they think would be helpful? I saw your hand first.
We are piloting a 2-gen project for non-English speaker families. The mothers are able to learn the early childhood licensing program, let's say like that, while their kid is in that side. But since I'm in operations of the pilot, I know what translating means, and I just wonder how else Teachstone is thinking on providing resources, because as I appreciate more and more by the minute how the teachers work and what they do, is just maybe are you thinking in constraints on time and maybe singling out, not that we don't want to, because obviously we want to include everybody, but do you think this, how this is going to impact the teachers? As much as we want to think about what we want to offer to the children, we see, and I'm seeing, that even for the mentor teacher that is working with the apprentice, it's a lot of work to think in both languages and to provide those resources in that specific language. So it's not like I'm not optimistic with what you say, but that work takes a lot of energy. Within our program, we do have, we pay for the translation to Spanish to all the centers that are involved in the program with us, in the pilot. Translation services are very expensive. When you have to print, when you have to elaborate materials, when you have to do any session, even if you bring simultaneous translation. And we're talking maybe about the most common language, that is Spanish, but there are pockets in regions where you have Arabic people or Vietnamese. So obviously I do appreciate, but I would think more about a strategy that brings people together in a way that serves the support of the teachers. Yeah. Because just solely the regular standard apprentice learning strategies that they have to work with is a lot to maybe then now compartmentalize, yeah, the work for certain specific children that obviously we want them to feel welcome, and we want to keep the tradition and understand the value of what they give us sharing their culture, and we want to embrace that. But what I think is that if that is not supported for the teachers to be effective in that, we might not see as many results as we would like to, because it's like they are alone doing this. And this takes leadership, and this takes a lot of money too. And that's what, at the very end, everybody needs, you know, the resources. But coming from Teachstone, what is Teachstone putting in place to disseminate, at the very least, the basics of the most common languages that there are in the country?
Yeah, Yeah, thank you for your reflections and for your question. Yeah, and as far as Teachstone is going, the majority of our offerings are in other languages are in Spanish, and we do have French. Right now, we are about to release the Spanish class, second edition, resources are being created. In addition to building like a library of the same resources that we have in English in Spanish, I'm not sure at this moment what we can say about other languages that are in Spanish. I know that Spanish is the main focus at the moment, but we can definitely follow up with you around what.
We have offered those
Yeah.
classes.
Yeah.
In California, we had a facilitator, and we had also somebody from Mexico. We have to find a name, but it's just this general idea, or maybe pieces of that are just that part in Spanish. If we're gonna offer it, we say that we are being responsive, we should be translating everything. And I know that's
Yeah.
not an example, but it's helpful for the teachers that really need that transition.
For sure, yeah, and it's so complicated, like you're saying too, right? Because there are educators who are supporting English learning whose first language is something different, right? And so then they're also trying to manage the expectations of that. And then there are educators who have 4 different languages represented in their classrooms, and they're trying to manage the expectations of that. And there are Head Start programs in which 10 home languages are represented in their entire program, and it can get really, really complicated. And then there's different levels of educators and coaches and leaders' proficiency with English, and then the resources that are being offered to them, right? So then there might be a teacher whose first language is Arabic, but then she's teaching a classroom of children whose first languages include Mandarin and Spanish in addition to English. So it can get really, really complicated. So I appreciate you bringing light to just how complex an issue it is, not only for the expectations that we have for teachers, but also for resourcing and the considerations that leadership also needs to have to be able to promote these things. And again, to just directly answer your question, as far as other languages go, I don't know what those plans are, but I do know that plans are in place for class second edition resources in Spanish. Yeah.
So I really appreciate how you talked about that initial sort of intake process and connecting with families to learn more about their traditions at home and their parenting and what would make them feel included. And I just want to surface that I think we can really go further with parents in general, where not only are we, meeting their needs as a provider of services, but they, as the main stakeholders in their children's development, really have the opportunity to lead in our programs. And so just want to surface that if we're serving families from a particular cultural tradition, how can we identify opportunities for them to lead? How do we create spaces for them to join decision-making tables, give us feedback, and create a space for like more of a feedback loop that I think that process that you named is a good beginning. But really creating a space, they can tell us what's wrong with what we're doing and what they need to participate if we create that invitation and regularly engage with them so they can constantly kind of help us course correct. Because I think everyone here has great intentions, but we might not necessarily know how to execute. But the families can really give us that if they feel safe and they feel invited to do so. It might not be in their cultural tradition to really provide that kind of feedback, but we can invite them to really be our partners in that. So I think that engagement piece, I would love to see letting parents lead include more than leading in the classroom at story time, but really leading in decision making and any kind of advisory board or any kind of, and again, there's an expense for that, right? We would need synchronous interpretation, can be expensive, but I think if we're very strategic and careful, they will show us things we couldn't imagine. And we will improve our program for everyone if we create a space to listen.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up too, and really elevating that parents are stakeholders and family members are stakeholders in their children, right? So when we think about advisory boards and councils, and they should have a place at that table too. And you're totally right. That brings another set of logistical questions that we have to answer, and processes and funding, and what if you can offer all the opportunities, and if families don't feel safe enough to take those opportunities on, then you might not have the attendance or the contributions that you thought you would have, right? And so there's definitely a process to undergo of making sure families feel safe, and then what are the resources that I need to put in place to make sure that they have those avenues, right? And that also, I know that we're coming up on time, but that also reminds me of programs with families who aren't proficient in reading or writing in any language, right? And so then how do we make sure that they feel safe enough to communicate with us and what they need, right? And so then how can we just rely on oral communication, especially when there's a language barrier? So again, it can get so complicated, but I appreciate you bringing up the need to involve families as decision makers in their children's education, especially at this early stage where we know that this is a foundation to the future. And so thanks for sharing that. And I know that we're up on time, but I just want to show you that I've linked here to Teachstone's page, but I've also linked to the personalized oral language learning strategies that Dr. Oliva Olsen has had a huge part in creating and developing. And so you can find more strategies that are very specific to DLL children and multilingual children. And the definitions and some of this information also is referenced in Early Edge California's Multilingual Learning Toolkit. So you'll see the link to that information there too, where they provide an overview of the principles of dual language learning and many different questions that educators have around supporting dual language learning in different areas: social, emotional, cognitive, content understanding, bilingual immersion programs. And so they break down the strategies, and if you go on their website, they also have a toolkit that has so many resources that are linked to each specific strategy. So those are some really great places to go to for a lot more specific information, and also information at the administrative level too. So not just for educators, but also for program leaders. So just thank you all so much, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.